Welcome tonight to our seminar on is it anxiety or is it a phobia? One of the things that's very interesting is that sometimes we really don't know who it is we're talking to. So I'm Dr. Mensah of Mensah Medical, co-founder of this institution, along with my partner, Dr. Judith Bowman. Let me tell you a little bit about how I got into this field. Firstly, let me just tell you, I am the world's biggest skeptic. I don't believe anything unless I not only see it in terms of the print and the research and all those fun things and years of testing, but then I've got to see it work with my patients. And it's a prayer, an answer to my sister's prayer, who's all into nutrition and everything, that I'm even in this field. I sit back sometimes and wonder, how on earth did this happen? I was a very traditional physician, family practice by training. And quite honestly, I was about to set off into the wonderful world of luxury. I was offered quite the lucrative contract in a small western town west of Chicago by a couple of hours, and I was literally just about to sign the second set of paperwork when I received a phone call from my now current partner. And she's just a wonderful person, Dr. Judith Bowman, this happy cheerleader type. And she said, "Albert, what are you doing these days?" I said, "Oh, Judy, I'm about to sign this really great contract out west, and I'm probably going to retire in about 8 years. They're setting me up." All of a sudden, I heard just silence. And I said, "Wait a minute, this is not my supportive cheerleader person that helps the entire universe with her glee and joy. What's wrong?" She said, "Oh, there's this place and this institution, and they do this and this and this, and they've got an opening." And I said, "Okay, so tell me about this place." "Oh, well, they work with chemistry and imbalances." I said, "Yeah." She said, "They use nutrients." I said, "Judy, come on. Supplements? We're talking about nutritional medicines?" She said, "Yeah, no, really, you've got to come out and see this place. You've got to come out and see it." So I said, "Okay, fine." And I went there and I met the ever so brilliant Dr. William Walsh, a man with one of the most amazing poker faces I've ever seen. Could not read this man. And after a discussion with him in a day at the facility and meeting arguably one of the most brilliant neuropsychiatrists I've ever met, Dr. DeVito at the time, chairman of the Department of Loyola for 20 years, psychiatry, my vast knowledge of brain functioning shrank down to the size of a walnut. And I was extremely humbled. But then I had to do some real thinking, because I had two choices. I could either go for the gusto and be done in about 8 to 10 years, or I could embark on a very different journey. And after much prayer work and discussion with my family and friends and a current fiance at the time, anyway, now my wife, I said, well, if this stuff is truly just malarkey, as they say, I can always go back to traditional medicine. However, if it's true that we can help individuals with autism, help individuals with anxiety and depression, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, without actually using any pharmaceutical medications as our primary modality, then this is huge. Well, that was about 8 years ago, and here I am today. So the skeptic became a believer. And now we don't only practice, but we also teach other physicians how to do what it is we do. And quite honestly, we owe all this to the work of the brilliant Dr. William Walsh, PhD, of the Walsh Research Institute, and to other individuals such as Dr. Carl Pfeiffer and Dr. Abram Halfer, all great pioneers in the field. But the idea here is that we can look at a variety of conditions, not purely from the perspective of some unknown mythical construct that occurs just in the mind, but that there's actually an organic cause. In the world of psychiatry, we look at things based upon what we call a lack of objective evidence, but really based upon symptoms. So somebody who seems uncomfortable all the time, a little bit edgy, a little bit of inner tension, we say, well, they're anxious. Unfortunately, that term is almost a diagnosis as opposed to simply a symptom. But we live in a few different worlds with regard to that word anxiety. There's anxiety that you experience based upon a circumstance. There's anxiety that you experience that is very targeted. There's also general anxiety, which for us in psychiatry tends to be more of a diagnosis. And we therefore treat patients based upon a set of symptomatologies or diagnoses rather than objective evidence. Now, that's because, as a primer, so to speak, in medicine we say that if you've tested everything you know how to test and you come up with no concrete evidence or support for the condition, then it's psychiatric. And it's now out here, and we use all sorts of fun drugs and things to sort of help regulate or downplay those symptoms like anxiety. Then there's the concept of phobias. And people would often say, well, aren't they kind of the same thing? And the answer is really no, they're not. Anxieties can be either situational or generalized. They can be temporary and transient or very consistent and ongoing. Phobias tend to really cause a problem of inner tension and turmoil when they're directed at that individual. So when that individual is not in the presence of or approaching that directed object or that directed circumstance, the phobia doesn't truly kick in. Now, there are some individuals who tend to ruminate or who are obsessed with a phenomenon, and it creates an ongoing phobia for them, such as agoraphobia or a fear of the outside. But once again, that's a very specific concept, even though it's worldwide. Okay. The idea is if they're indoors, without thinking about going outdoors, they're fine. But mention having to go to the grocery store, and inner turmoil, anxiety, tension, palpitations, fears arise. All these things truly rooted in the idea that there is a very specific environment, region, or concept that is a trigger for these individuals. The same for a fear of snakes. We call it snakeophobia. At least I do. There are ways of dealing with these phobias, in addition to that, that are very different than what we would expect in, for example, biochemical imbalances. With snake fears and animal fears, oftentimes desensitization therapies work very, very well. You slowly introduce the particular idea or concept that is troubling to that patient. First, maybe a picture of a snake. Then it may be a closer picture of a snake. And then we may actually put a real snake in the room somewhere, of course, protected and guarded from the patient. And slowly but surely, over time, that fear kind of erodes. So those are the ideas sort of behind the idea of phobias versus anxiety. Now, the crossover is that pretty much when you've got a phobia, you tend to be anxious about that phobia. But what about the people who don't have phobias, who don't have these specific constructs, yet they're anxious? Well, now we go back to the idea of a specific anxiety or even general anxiety. And in medicine, we know we have a construct called general anxiety disorder. It means most of the time you're just kind of sitting around and you're just anxious no matter what's going on. The love of your life could be there. You're still kind of anxious, even though that lovely person is still present. Or nothing may be going on and you're trying to sleep, but you've got this inner tension and this ongoing anxiety. What we've come to see is that there are actually tests that you can perform at an organic level that can determine imbalances that are present that lead to these anxieties or contribute to these phobias. Okay. Now, there are a variety of elements that we really want to talk about here. One, we firstly kind of spoken of a little bit of the definitions behind anxiety, general anxieties versus phobias in particular. And we recognize that they are not the same things, although they may be sort of on different ends of a spectrum. Okay. But the other question is cause. Why is this person who's had anxiety all their lives, why are they anxious? And why isn't their brother or sister anxious? Why isn't their parent anxious? But they are. Moms and dads have been scratching their heads for a very long time with regard to this particular child, wondering what's going on, and then through the teenage years. Well, what we're seeing is that there are actual biochemical imbalances that can lead to things like anxiety, and therefore not necessarily cause phobias, but support and worsen the intensity of that particular feeling, that particular emotion that's associated with a phobia. What are some of these imbalances? Well, a lot of times they're metal dysregulatory imbalances. For example, high levels of copper. In many of our discussions about pathology, we talk about copper, and that's because copper is a neurostimulant. It acts in two different ways. Number one, it is a direct stimulator of nerve cells. So copper in excess can cause neuronal firing. This goes back to a study done way back in 1942. And they put in a few milligrams of copper in a petri dish with a nerve cell. And guess what that nerve cell did? It lit up. So we knew that electrical excitability occurs when copper is placed or introduced into the system. The other side is that copper is very necessary to help convert dopamine into norepinephrine. So we know in many states of anxiety, you have high levels of norepinephrine. So now, understanding that, what did we do in our traditional medical perspective? We said, well, hey, if we can modulate the norepinephrine, we can help bring down these anxiety disorders. So we came out with lovely drugs, such as the SNURPs, we came out with the Paxils, calming things that affect the neurotransmitters themselves. And there's nothing wrong with that. But the other side is, well, if there is a way to sort of modulate the end product from a pharmaceutical perspective, what about working on letting the body produce or regulate itself? How would we go about doing that? In the case of copper and high levels of copper, the key is to actually bring down those levels of copper. And we can do that using very natural and effective means through nutrient therapies. Well, that's all fine and dandy, but what if you don't live in well water? And what if you don't eat off of copper cutlery and cook with copper utensils and things like that? Well, there are many other reasons to have anxiety. For example, low levels of zinc in the system. Zinc is a very important modulator of neurotransmitter development. Zinc and vitamin B6 together regulate the development of serotonin and norepinephrine, as well as gamma-aminobutyric acid. We call it GABA. GABA has a very calming effect on the system. And these are some very important elements that when they are out of balance or dysregulated, can produce or allow for anxiety to occur. GABA being, of course, a calming neurotransmitter, and norepinephrine being an excitatory neurotransmitter, it kind of stands to reason that one major element would control both, because it means that you're going to have an equal distribution and therefore balance of both neurotransmitters. Okay? So having very low levels of zinc can contribute to anxiety and depression disorders. Having high copper can also do that. One thing we haven't spoken about yet is the non-metal side of things. There's a construct we call methylation. It involves that little organic molecule we call a methyl, a carbon and 3 or 4 hydrogens. Methyl groups are actually very, very important in the activation or the suppression of enzymes, neurotransmitters, hormones. Also at a genetic level, DNA, methyl actually suppresses many different types of genes, especially cancer genes. We've seen that objectively in the field of oncology and cancer treatment and cancer research. They discovered, well, they didn't discover, but they emphasized the fact that they noted that certain genes would all of a sudden arise and become highly active, and these tended to be in people who were undermethylated. At the time, they started to use therapies that they thought would actually help methylate individuals. Unfortunately, the therapies they were using demethylated these individuals, and their cancers got worse. But it was actually our brilliant Dr. Walsh who came up and, evaluating this research, said, no, the ideas were actually solid. The wrong therapeutic treatment was implemented. Well, that's science for you, unfortunately. And I don't mean to sound kind of light about that, but sometimes mistakes are made, not necessarily in the judgment, but in the execution of a certain process. But methylation is a very, very important element to help us keep balanced and regulated with regard to our neurotransmitters and hormones and so forth. Now, what that does is that it supposedly will help keep us balanced as opposed to anxious, depressed, irritable, or any of those other constructs. Many disorders we've seen are associated with undermethylation. We know that ADD, ADHD, is often associated with undermethylation. Autism tends to be very, very prominently associated with undermethylation. OCD type behaviors are often seen in individuals who are undermethylated. Anorexia as well, Alzheimer's disease. Many of these elements are seen to be associated with undermethylation. Now, where there's an undermethylation, there's of course an overmethylation, and then there's also a normal methylation. But on the side of undermethylation, what's key here is that if we understand, firstly, that the condition of the patient is one of undermethylation, we can now choose some of the very drugs that we use to treat patients a little bit better, because many of the drugs that we have can adversely affect methylation. Now, if we have individuals who are over-methylated and we give them many of our stereotypical medications, such as our SSRIs, elements like fluoxetine, Paxil, Zoloft, etc., they can actually make a person's depression worse. Okay, they affect the methyl adversely, and they do that because what they do is that they actually affect the histamine component of this. Now, we haven't talked yet about histamine, but histamine and methyl have the teeter-totter opposite side effect. When you have high levels of methyl, you have low levels of histamine. And when you have high levels of histamine, you tend to have low levels of methyl. The reason is because methyl and histamine are antagonistic. Methyl lowers histamine. Now then, if you have low levels of histamine and you give someone an antihistaminic medication, it further suppresses them and they become more depressed and more anxious. And unfortunately, if that pressure is severe enough, many individuals move into suicidal ideation, behavior, and even homicidal acts. We've all seen, well, most of us have seen, the disturbing news footage for the past year or so of young people who are taking out guns and shooting and killing individuals. And when you look at their circumstances, many of these people had recently started an antidepressant or an antipsychotic medication a few weeks prior to the onset of their actions. Dr. Walsh is doing a beautiful study on the circumstances involving these kinds of shootings. His early work was with prison sociopaths and criminality and so forth, and how chemically people can be predisposed or pushed into certain arenas or certain conditions. But methylation is a very, very important arena that we look at with regard to anxiety and depression, because being too undermethylated can cause anxiety as well. Instead of talking about a genotype, let's talk about a phenotype. What does an undermethylator look like? An undermethylator tends to be a perfectionistic individual. These are the folks who dot their I's and cross their T's. These are the individuals who tend to do very well academically because they're never satisfied until something is perfect. So hence they tend to progress quite well through school. They may go to graduate school. I often call them the D's, the MDs, the JDs, the PhDs. They're also the high-powered salesmen. They're also the secretaries. Anyone you would consider to be one of your very, very, very meticulous type individuals. Oftentimes, they have an element of undermethylation present. Now, the overmethylators tend to be more your laid-back individuals. These are the folks who are kind of okay, kind of your smooth jazz, easy listening kind of folks. Very, very creative. They're your philosophers, your artists, your musicians. They're geniuses on a different level, and they have their own way. Many of the people we talk about, we say, they kind of march the beat of their own drum. Now, when an undermethylator, though, say someone who has a very perfectionistic tendency, moves into an environment where they don't have control, it becomes very, very frustrating and difficult. And the longer they're there, the more they're fighting against their own inner tension as it increases because of this lack of control. We can't regulate what our bosses are telling us to do, even though we've had 30 years experience in this job, and we know how it works, and our boss just came out of diaper school over there, and they're trying to tell me how to do this, and it's the wrong way. And we go home frustrated, angry, upset. or we think we've got great ideas and great expressions on how to get a project done, but people don't listen. That inner tension grows, and sometimes we become anxious as a result. So methylation often has an indirect and a direct effect. From the psychological side, as we call it, the environmental stimulation and frustration against which our own inner perfectionisms fight against, we're creating anxiety. But our basic chemistry may be already prone to those sorts of anxieties because of the neurotransmitter imbalances created by micronutrient imbalances. So there are two varieties and two ways that we sort of move through these periods or these discussions with regard to anxieties and depressions and phobias. Now then, so we've talked about metals, we've talked about methylation, we've talked about a few different elements that are circumstantially or environmentally based. Now, one thing we cannot leave out, of course, are tried and true hormonal issues. Okay, hyperthyroidism, for example, leading to anxiety and depression. The heart starts to beat irregularly and very quickly. We feel this strange inner tension all over the place, and we become visibly anxious. Now, these are organic causes, and we're all very familiar with them. But just because we're talking about micronutrients, we can't leave out the tried and true traditional stuff either. It's all part of our evaluation regimen or paradigm. Okay, so all that fun sort of stuff said and done. We've got chemistry, we've got circumstances, we've got metals, we've got traditional stuff. So what do we do about it? Okay. Well, the first thing we always want to do is that we want to test. That's what we do in our society. We have people sitting around thinking of 1,000 ways to test things. Why, let's test the bathroom, let's test the toilet, let's test our teachers, let's test our doctors, let's test everyone and everything. Well, we don't deviate from that paradigm either. There's actual testing capacity for these elements, these micronutrient imbalances, for methylation. All those tests can be done, and just like the true medical model, there have to be certain requirements that are fulfilled. Number one, there must be what's called validity. What you're seeking to test must truly measure what you're looking to test. Number two, it has to be reproducible. In other words, if you and I do the same test, we should get the same result. And if Joe down the block and in another country does the same test with the same patient, they should get the same results. This produces what we call reliability and validity. The third side comes into play in terms of reproducibility. Actually, I think that's what we just talked about, reproducibility. But the fourth side really comes in when we're talking about treatment. We test because we can treat and we can get improvement or resolution. Many doctors and many individuals will tell you, if there's a test for something, but you can't really cure it or fix it, a lot of the times we don't really consider doing the testing anymore. We just say, well, you can treat, empirically, okay, with a presumption, but not worry about the rest. We don't do that. Okay. We do indeed do our testing, and then we develop treatment protocols that are nutrient-based in order to affect the changes that are necessary. We look for methyl groups to donate into the system for the undermethylator. We look at elements that remove methyl groups for the overmethylator. We rebalance the zinc and the copper levels and other chemistries that are out of balance. Now, while we're talking about that, you probably want to say, well, do you have your own lab? We don't directly have our own lab, but we use probably the world's best resource for biochemical imbalance lab testing through direct healthcare access to labs out of Mount Prospect, Illinois. We send over the orders, they coordinate the laboratory testing, and our patients go there, or anyone can go there or call there for information about how to get testing done. And they give us the results, and then we go from there. Okay. So once all that is said and done, then we're able to really address and deal with the issues at hand in a very, very regimented and complete fashion that, again, we train doctors all over the world on how to use this methodology. Now, this may sound like a whole bunch of new stuff or a whole bunch of hooey to people all over the world, but the simple fact is that if you're doubting, don't believe me, I didn't believe me. I didn't believe my friends who brought me into this field. But what I believed were individuals who were given the traditional diagnosis of schizophrenia and are now holding down part-time jobs and going to school part-time. What I did believe was people whose anxiety levels became extremely calm after proper treatment. People whose phobias were helped by first balancing the chemistry and then deconstructing the cause and desensitizing individuals who now had very specific phobias. Okay. So we're not saying we're the only therapy out there. What we're saying is that we're part of a piece of a larger puzzle, and that all the pieces, or as many pieces as we can find and figure out, need to come together. Now, for many people who may not be very familiar with what we're talking about, or perhaps this went too quickly for them, I recommend this book, Nutrient Power, by Dr. William Walsh, PhD. Here in this book is basically a much greater elaboration of the concepts and ideas that we've been talking about. It's available on Amazon. Sounds like a commercial, but I don't intend to be. What I'm sharing with people is that there is a great resource out there that they can obtain that speaks about biochemical imbalances and the science behind them. And we're talking about real science. This is not simply an individual who sits around and kind of guesses what's going on with folks and says, well, based upon your symptoms, no. We know that chemistry is very consistent. If it weren't, we wouldn't be here as human beings. If it weren't, a mom and a dad couldn't get together and have a child. They would have a cat or a dog. Okay? That's genetics and so forth. But it doesn't happen that way. There is order, there is regulation, and we have, over the course of 30 and 40 years, really come to outline, understand, and critique and correlate imbalances that are biochemical in nature, symptoms such as anxiety and depression. And by the way, they go hand in hand. Over the past several years, as we've talked more and more to our patients and our friends and our families, we've come to see that there's an interesting relationship. Sometimes we ask the question, is it the chicken or is it the egg? Which came first, anxiety or depression? Well, for some people, the anxiety came first. And having anxiety for such a long period of time led to depression. So now we have two elements that are now walking through life hand in hand. For other individuals, it was actually depression. And they sat back and they say, well, you know what? I've been depressed for so long that I'm anxious about the fact that I may never get out of my depression. Okay? So now we actually start to develop phobias and concerns because maybe that depressed person or that anxious person doesn't want to feel awkward in a crowd. And so they start to shy away from crowds. So now every time that there's a party or a social event, a graduation, now we have challenges and we pretty much start to stay away. And we develop a phobia. Now this aspect becomes more of a learned behavior. We sort of de-acclimated ourselves as opposed to acclimating ourselves. Those pieces do very well with regard to therapy. But once again, let's deal with the chemistry first, balance that, and now all those other therapies tend to work very, very well together. I've got a colleague a good friend of mine who's not a physician, but we've known each other all the way since college. I won't mention any names. But he called me the other day, literally, and he said, you know, Al, I've got this thing going on at work, and this has been happening for 2 weeks, and I'm really, really getting anxious. I said, well, dude, as we call ourselves back in college days, what are you doing for it? He said, well, I haven't really done anything for it. And we've tested his chemistry. We know what was going on. We said, well, have you tried this micronutrient? And he said, well, you know, I've got some. I think I can dust it off the shelf. I said, well, you know, if it's been within a certain time period, you can go ahead and use it. So he tried some. And now here we were just dealing with a symptom of anxiety because his was situational at the time. I talked to him 2 days later. I said, how you doing? He said, oh, I am so much better. And I'll even tell you, for that particular person and his chemistry, there's a correlation. We use an element known as inositol. It's actually a form of a B vitamin that can treat symptoms. Okay? There's no drug toxicity. There are no side effects. You can stop and start it as you so wish without any addictive capacities. If it doesn't work for you, you pretty much know in 45 minutes and you stop. Okay? That is not to push that product. We don't have any stock in it, as I often say. Okay? But the idea here is that here's an example of an element that, when done under the auspices of a healthcare practitioner, can be utilized to alleviate someone's condition as a circumstantial piece, meaning a symptom. It's not treating the underlying cause. That we do in parallel. But as part of the picture, this young man can't wait 3 months or 6 months. His job is on the line. He's got to have symptomatic relief now. So we look to add elements into the program that will help take care of the feeling, the perception now, versus, or while we also work on the biochemical imbalances that are really causing the condition. So there are a variety of things that can be done. Now, I'm not saying that's the only element out there. I was just giving you an example. But the key here is that the first thing we see is that there's a problem. Someone has what we call anxiety. Someone has a phobia. I can tell you there's 7 different biotypes, at least, biochemical constructs that can cause that symptom of anxiety. So if you use just a regular medication or one particular protocol, I'm not picking on the pharmaceutical industry here, but if you're using one particular protocol based upon just a symptom and never dealing with the actual underlying cause, you don't really get resolution. You're continually bailing out the bathwater, but you didn't turn off the faucet. Okay? We want us as an entire community to learn to turn off the faucets so that when we're bailing out that water, we don't only have to do it for so long, and then we get to stop. Okay? That's what we're looking at with this approach. Now, are we saying that medicine is simply not useful? Absolutely, positively not. In our field, we use medicine. It's important. But what we recognize is that some individuals, for those individuals, the medication actually works better by adding the supplements to them, okay, and testing the chemistry. There are some individuals who do so well that they no longer need the medications. That may not necessarily be everyone, but there are people where it happens, okay? It all depends on the cause. Now, having said all this, I've got to say that it's not necessarily one imbalance. We are individuals because there are a variety of things going on, and in many cases of anxiety syndromes, there are multiple reasons, multiple underlying causes that are coming together and clashing in a big bang cataclysm of emotional disruption. Okay, so teasing out and finding as many of these causes as possible is very, very important. And that's why a very good, thorough evaluation by a physician is what's necessary. You know, you can no more sit at home, read a book, not even this book can you sit at home, read, and figure yourself out. There are too many symptoms that are similar between biochemical imbalances. Okay, you need to have a physician working with you or a practitioner working with you. You need to have the testing. You need to have those correlations done by a professional between chemistry and symptoms. You need to put together the right diagnosis, and you need, most importantly, the right concentrations of those nutrient supplements working together. Lots of people can come up with a great idea. Well, you know what? I eat a lot of meat, so I get a whole lot of zinc into my system. I should be just fine. I don't need to worry about a zinc imbalance. Well, I love this one commercial. It would take 13 bowls of total cereal in order to equal, now that's taken 3 times a day, by the way, so, 13 times 3 to get the same amount of zinc that's in this prescription supplement. Okay? You get the idea. It's not going to happen by diet. It's not going to happen by guesswork. You need to have a regimented program that is specific and targeted to the individual person. Because we were all truly a microcosm of several different biochemical abnormalities superimposed on genetics and epigenetics, such that our environmental stimuli literally affect our genetic expression. Okay. Now,
explain epigenetics, please.
Epigenetics.
Epigenetics.
Epigenetics in 5 minutes. It's going to be very hard to do, but we're going to try. Okay. Epigenetics is a very important and new field. This is where much of the research in behavior, in genetic therapy, in cancer research, and a lot of other research paradigms are really moving to. The idea is that well, first of all, let me show you the difference between genetics and epigenetics, because many people want to know that. Genetics tends to be inherited in a very specific pattern for different disorders. It may be this generation, or maybe skipping every generation, or maybe females only, or males only. It all depends on the specific genetic disorder. Epigenetics, on the other hand, can travel through every single person in the family. Most of the people in the family may be there but not show up as a visible manifestation through anyone in that particular generation, but show up in the next generation. What's literally going on here is that from day 16 to day 21 in the womb, when most people, I'll say people, because a husband is also pregnant at the same time his wife is, judging by the weight we all gain with our kids, during day 16 and 21, there are influences going on in the womb during development that we're not even sure about because we don't even know we're pregnant. But whether it's ionizing radiation or ultra waves, sound waves, or different amounts of extreme nucleic acids, folic acid, methylation changes going on in the environment of the womb. It's not necessarily our fault, we don't know, but they are affecting how the markers of genetic expression are present or shifting. And by markers, they're kind of like flags that say to different chemicals, cut here, produce this protein. But now when those markers change, that protein that we're supposed to make, that enzyme we're supposed to make, that hormone or neurotransmitter, somehow gets modified. That modification might be minimal. That modification may produce a huge defect or a partial defect, which could mean that, say, that enzyme or hormone may function normally, partially, or not at all. Now, we know with any hormone or any enzyme, there's a domino effect. And those domino effects oftentimes translate literally from the gene level all the way to something like anxiety. Why? Because from point A to point ZZZ, the ultimate effect was that our neurotransmitters are not either turned on, they're partially activated, or they're not even produced in the right amounts or concentrations. So imbalances show up. Epigenetics involves truly what we used to call, in some respects, nature versus nurture, and that old debate. Well, it's neither. It's a combination of the two. Because what we're seeing is that it's the environmental cues and environmental stimuli that are literally affecting development in the womb that leads to who this person is. Well, you say, I'm not too sure about that. Do you have any kind of real examples? The one I really enjoy is the identical twins. Okay, I'm pretty sure that a few people in the world watch the Lifetime channel. I will confess, my wife watched it. Now she's got me watching it, although I can't let her see that or see this video. Okay? But we often hear about the twins, the evil twin and the good twin. I used to sit back and be kind of puzzled because when we think scientifically, this is supposed to be the same person, really, right? It's the same egg, the same sperm that was fused together to produce this entity. And somewhere, after all the little bubbles and little separation and little growth of cells was occurring, it's split into two separate cell lines that are developing. But the fact is, the same genetic DNA pieces are in all those cells. So why does one turn out evil and the other one good? Some people say, well, it's obviously the environment because, this one, the mom didn't pay any attention to him growing up and mom bathed all the love and joy on this one. But what if it didn't happen that way? These people are still growing up very, very different. What if one of them ends up with a diagnosis of bipolar disorder and the other one turns out to be fine? Yet when you look at them, you literally can't tell them apart physically. Okay. What happened was during those early developmental days when the eggs were multiplying, the cells were multiplying, there were microscopic changes in the expression, in the markers of DNA, such that it led to an entirely different personality type in the one twin and stayed pure and true in the other twin. A lot of the cancer studies were showing us that. One twin may have developed cancer. The other one may have been 30 to 40% more likely than the general population, but didn't develop cancer. Okay. So we're seeing this on multiple levels. Epigenetics involves environmental conditions and stimuli and changes superimposed on what is the baseline genetic aspect of the patient. Okay. What does that sort of have to do with us? A lot. Because as we search for reasons for things like autism, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, we note that if we do family histories, we're seeing that people who've got stuff happening to them, and I'm going to be general, people who've got stuff happening, had parents, aunts, uncles, cousins, who had stuff happen to them. And they had grandparents who had stuff happen to them. Case in point, Mr. So-and-so, can you tell me about your Aunt Lucy, your great Aunt Lucy? Oh, well, now, I got to tell you, we didn't talk too much about great Aunt Lucy. She sort of sat there in the corner and just kind of stared. Or she got sent off someplace in a home. Or very sadly, great Uncle Edgar committed suicide. But what about the generation after Uncle Edgar? That generation, we see anxiety, we see depression, we see alcoholism. It's not guesswork and it's not luck, bad luck or otherwise, that entire families are showing up with lineages of stuff happening. And it goes all the way back, I say, to the great caveman ancestor Ugg and his mate Uggina. And they got together and created this whole mess for everyone, okay, along the same family cell lines. So now, warning, young people today and starting from the 60s got real smart and decided, we don't care what our parents think, we're in love, and we're going to get married, and we'll introduce our mates to our families later. Well, surprise, surprise, when your mate finds out about your, shall we say, misbehaving cousin Edgar, and the generation before that where he had severe alcoholism. And all of a sudden there's bipolar disorder in generations before that. And now we're seeing there's autism. And autism associated with Asperger's generationally, one generation to the other, and associated with alcoholism. What we're seeing are actual lineages of undermethylation in many cases, or overmethylation, and the different manifestations or expressions. So you got me talking about epigenetics. We can't talk about epigenetics without really discussing methylation disorders. But the key here is that with epigenetics, that can be transmitted from generation to generation to generation. Each change gets shifted and gets passed on. Whereas with genetics, if there were some type of change, that doesn't necessarily get passed on to the next generation. So they're very different elements. It's just not a philosophical thing of, well, now we call this genetics and this one is the environment hitting the genetics. No, the genes behave differently when we're talking about epigenetic disorders versus genetic disorders. I hope I didn't over-answer your question.
Thank you for working on that with me.
Are there any points of clarification you'd like, though? I know I said a lot of things there.
No, that's good, thank you.
Any other questions? I know we sort of talked about a lot here and kind of put a lot of things out there. But what I really want you to understand, this is such a very powerful topic because so many people in this country and around the world are either anxious or depressed or fearful. And it's a terrible thing to have a phobia because it creates a limitation, it creates a wall around which your being is trapped. Cannot go to the store, cannot get into a car, cannot get on a plane. At this point in time, we don't have teleportation, but you want a vacation in Hawaii, and you're living in Texas. How are you going to get there? Somehow you've got to leave your house, board some type of vehicle to get you to some type of port or station where you're going to get into a very crowded situation. And then that crowded situation is going to be traveling for at least a few hours, or maybe half of the day, depending on where you're going, and you're stuck. So what happens? Your quality of life suffers. It's not just the fear, it's what it does for the rest of you. And heavens, what if you have a spouse or children involved? And now they can't enjoy you, enjoying them, enjoying other people as a group function. You can't go to a baseball game. You can't go to a basketball game. What, the American pastime? Baseball? Hot dogs, apple pie, Chevrolet. I have no stock in Chevrolet either. But if you can't enjoy it, then what is the quality of life for you? It's extremely difficult. This is why we talk about these particular disorders, these particular conditions. There are more people who are anxious and therefore depressed walking around than you can shake your finger at. It's amazing. It's even found its way into mainstream television programming. I was watching one TV show where rapid fire people are talking about, oh, it's a docudrama, and we're going to solve this murder crime and this murder mystery. And one of the key people says, well, my therapist says that I need to do this and this. Have we not heard that kind of a comment before on a TV program? And I said, oh yeah, let me go ahead and take my Paxil, my Xanax, my whatever it is because of my anxiety. Or a spouse says, did you take your medication today? We're seeing this on mainstream television, which means it's so pervasive in our society and our culture that it's sitting there with us all the time. And it's not just some freaky individual who's got some queer quirk. It's absolutely now becoming a mainstream underpinning. It's too commonplace, and that makes me very uncomfortable. That makes me a very not happy practitioner, because it means that we're not doing our jobs. Our job is supposed to be to find what we can find, treat what we can treat, and really not rest until we reach that state of having helped our patients to the maximum. Now, don't get me wrong. We are responsible for what we know, and what we don't know, we're not responsible for. We all have very specific forms of training, and most of us work to the best of our capacities given the training that we have. But what's key is that we don't ignore new research. We don't ignore new paradigms. And like I said, I'm a skeptic. I'll take a look at something, and first I'll be sitting there thinking this is a bunch of stuff. But the idea here is, let me not be closed-minded until I've heard the evidence, until I've looked at the caseloads, until I've looked at the research that says we've got some plausibility here. And if there is plausibility and there is a mechanism by which this is reproducible, by which it's testable, by which we can share with our colleagues and get good benefits, then we owe it to ourselves and we owe it to our patients in order to truly pursue those avenues. If we don't, then we cease to be what it is we took an oath at graduation day from med school to be, which is to be a doctor, which is to be a healer, which is to be someone who will do their best for their patients. Their best does not mean we see you for 10 minutes, give you some medication, say goodbye, and see you in 3 months. Okay? That is not good enough for us. And that's why we strive, along with researchers like Dr. William Walsh, Dr. Abraham Hoffer, previous years, to push, to continue to learn. There are many doctors in the world, by the way, who are doing just that. Many in the United States. We're all striving to seek it better. When we find it, now we've got to use it. And we've got to do our best. Assuming, of course, we don't do harm. That's of the utmost importance. Our methodology is not harmful. There aren't side effects. Worst case scenario, there may be some smelly supplements and some bad taste, and pretty much that's about it. One of my favorite side effects of the process that we do is improved health, physical health. Because when we use targeted nutrient therapy in the concentrations that we use, usually the body gets more than enough of what it needs if the brain is being healed. And what I didn't say before is that the body and the brain pretty much multitask with the same elements. If you think about zinc, we know that zinc is important for neurotransmitter development, as we talked about before, but zinc is also important for growth. It's important for stress handling. It's important for your hair and your nails. Obviously, I might need a little bit more zinc. But for many individuals, if you see a child growing, they're growing because of their zinc, okay, at least in part. And if you see a child that is not doing too terribly well, you often consider, is there a nutrient imbalance? Is there a malabsorption entity present? Those sort of things that might be impeding their growth. Because zinc is a huge multitasker. Stimulates immune function. It helps with wound healing. It helps with preventing colds. Not so much your vitamin C, believe it or not, Thank you, Dr. Linus Pauling. It does play a role, but it's not the key necessarily. And a plethora. Go home and Google zinc and see if you don't get a page and a half on the internet about simply point by point by point by point what zinc does. Okay? So multitasking is what these elements are doing. So our side effect profile looks like improved health. Many of our patients, when asked, you know what, when was the last time you had a cold? I say, gosh, I don't remember. Now, I'm not saying that if you take our supplements, you're going to be guaranteed. What we're saying is that along with treating the cognitive aspects of your condition, the body too will benefit from it. Okay. What did Forrest Gump say? I think that's about all I have to say about that. Could go on and on and on, but we want to make sure we have more time for questions.
What about a personality disorder? Does this kind of process work for them too?
Absolutely.
I'm thinking like of a confrontational person, and nobody knows what's going on.
Well, once again, first things first, we do an extensive history. We look at family history. That's why we talk about family history so easily, because this is what we do as part of our process for every single patient. When we see these individuals, we talk about their history, their family history, then we test. Now, what some people consider to be a personality disorder is actually not a personality disorder. It is an aberration that has been present since birth because of a capacity or an incapacity to deal with certain biochemical elements. For example, we talked about copper. We know that in young males, literally starting from 2 to 3 years of age, their behavior is rather oppositional. It can be very rowdy. These kids often are the ones who are out turning over garbage can lids and garbage cans, and unfortunately by the time they're 15 or 16 years of age, they've got a rap sheet, as they say, from juvie. Okay? And some of the sadder things, they can end up in jail and their lives are actually moved in the wrong direction because of what was an unknown biochemical deficit or imbalance. We know this because we've done the studies. One of our favorite examples, a family of 4. Wonderful, rich suburban area, affluent family. 3 sons actually doing extremely well. One going to graduate school, one going to college, one in high school, straight A students. Okay. Number 4, on his way to prison, okay, in trouble with the law all the time. And what did we call them in the past? The black sheep of the family. Absolutely. They say, well, Martha, we did well with 3 out of 4. That's not a bad percentage. Okay. Well, no, it should have been 4 out of 4. This particular individual, when his copper was tested, was extremely high. There's some people who biochemically are not capable of detoxifying certain elements in their systems. And those things build up in toxic levels and affect ultimately behavior and cognition. They're not bad people. They just had bad chemistry. When Dr. Walsh, in his prison studies, back in the early days, examined many of these individuals, these are the findings that he had. He actually doesn't believe that they're bad people. He believes there's bad chemistry. But you know what? It's treatable. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that everyone gets turned into a saint magically. I'm not saying that everyone, because you've got to kind of follow the program here. The results for individuals, of course, as they say, are going to vary. But the idea here is that if you don't treat it, you're going to be in big trouble. When you begin the treatment process, people tend to do better. And these individuals who are supposedly oppositional can actually turn out to be sweethearts. By the way, when the young man that I told you about in this example, when he was treated, graduate school, no more prison, no more trouble, just had to get rid of those toxic elements. Okay. So how we label is a very interesting thing, because we've come up with all of these disorders because we didn't know about the chemistry at the time that they came up. So we have an oppositional personality disorder, we have a narcissistic disorder, we have a this disorder, we have a that disorder. I'm not saying there's no validity to those namesakes, but some of those things are truly rooted in imbalances. We don't know until we test first.
Is that true with narcissistic personalities, that can be improved nutritionally? That's another one that can be helped?
Well, that's one of the ones that I can honestly say we don't see a tremendous volume of. primarily because
They don't.
you got it. Problem's not with me. It's with the rest of the world. Obviously, they're insane. If people lived like I lived, they'd be no problem. If they just listened to me, life would be grand. And you know what? You need to think more about how your situation affects me, Al Mensah. Okay. No, not really. Dr. Mensah says that's not the way it goes. But the idea here is that they're not going to usually come for help because of their condition. Okay. These folks, on the other hand, that are oppositional, somebody's usually dragging them in. Come here, Junior, before you get kicked out of grep. We've had children, little boys, one little boy in particular, kicked out of preschool. Haven't gotten to first grade yet. Looked at his chemistry. Beautifully messed up. And I say that because the worse the chemistry is, the better patients do. He was treated, did fine. We've had several cases like that. This is nothing new. But whenever someone comes along with these diagnoses, they really do warrant investigation. Okay. Not saying that all of them are treatable like that, but they do.
How is this information, or is this information getting passed into the educational systems? You know, for those youth that have IEPs, 504s, is the educational system getting this information yet? Because I know that they're real quick to say, as you talked about last week, this child's not cooperating, we need to, get him on something.
The educational system is very hard-pressed to shift as fast as we are. Unfortunately, it's full of bureaucracy. And in order to get anything done, the question is, now, do we have the right forms? Do we have the right information? Do we have the right research? Do we have it proven? And is this going to be a test subject case? We've got to run it through this. We've got to run it through that. Years and years of red tape. And by the time you've gotten a quarter of the way through the process, a principal has changed. A master of whatever school or district has changed. You start the process all over again. It's been a slow-moving phenomenon. We're glad to have IEPs at this point, because to me, that's a real congratulations to the system for realizing that there are challenges through which individuals can work and get some help and need that help on a one-on-one level in schools. But unfortunately, this piece of education is harder to permeate. It usually comes through the parents and into the system from that direction. Okay? And the IEPs are aware, the therapists are aware, because they're the ones being exposed while they're helping that individual child. So I have to say kudos and blessings to parents for their consistent pushing, striving, and researching in order to find help for their children and their family members. They're really going to be the ones to turn the tables in the school systems and in our medical education. Any other questions?
So, say somebody made an appointment, does it just depend on person's individual history? Would it be like a month-long thing, or do you find out the testing lasts for one day, or just trying to think of what is the process then?
Well, if I understand correctly, I think you want to know what the methodology is and sort of the timing behind things.
Yeah, if you decided to be a patient.
Certainly. If you decide to be a patient, the first thing you have is you'll come in and you will see a nurse and a physician. Actually, you can see two, me and my partner at the same time, for an evaluation. You'll spend about 45 minutes to an hour with the nurse going through tidbits of clinical history, actually more background information. Then you'll spend anywhere between 1 hour and an hour and a half with the doctors, talking about your current situation, the past history, family history, situations, circumstances, whatever we feel is appropriate to sort of elucidate what's really going on. The next step is testing. That's where we send you to go to one of the labs to have blood drawn and urine drawn and whatever else we feel is necessary. Then we get back those test results, and that usually takes about anywhere between, the test results usually take about 2 weeks to 3 weeks at most to get back. And then we're busy putting together or addressing the nutrient protocol we feel will be beneficial for you, usually within about a month's time. It all depends on timing. The sooner you get your labs done, usually the sooner that everything comes into play. Now, after that, we tend to reevaluate you in about 6 months formally in terms of your chemistry. But we have an ongoing communication relationship. If there are other lab tests that need to be done, that's usually 3 months after the initial evaluation. And then any tweaking occurs usually around 6 months, and then we reevaluate at 1 year as well. Then we tend to see most people on a yearly basis thereafter. So there's an ongoing process. It's not stagnant at all. You'll be receiving a nurse case manager who will help you with your situation. She'll be the kind of the go-to person, the filter between you and us. Any questions you have, she'll bring to us if she can't answer them. Our nurses are great. They've got about 33 years worth of experience between the two of them. Specifically with regard to dealing with biochemical imbalances and how they affect all types of disorders.
And a number of your patients do still stay with some of their psychiatric drugs? Or do you tend
Some do. The reason is that what we've seen is that with drug therapy, depending on the drug that they're on, it tends to change brain chemistry. So some individuals are able to wean down to a more manageable dose with fewer side effects. Some individuals are able to actually just stop. I don't mean just stop, but I mean wean down over time to the point of non-utility. And some individuals will always need that support, that help. It all depends on what constellation of symptomatologies was hitting what kind of genes or genetics, or epigenetics for that matter. There's such a huge number of variables that come into play. But the key thing here is working together with either the pharmaceuticals or not in order to get improvement. We all determine that together. And we like to work with the practitioners who are providing the medications too, with the permission of the patients. So we can kind of talk about which drugs might be the best drug for the patient and which drugs might be a little bit more challenging because of things like methylation status or histamine. At some point, we also talk about dietary issues. It's sort of the opposite side of nutrient therapy. You can actually eat opposite to your chemistry. People talk about eating for your blood type. People talk about eating for this type and that type. Well, we know for sure that because of the true science in methylation disorders, anything that takes methyl away is going to be problematic for some people and beneficial for other people. So like my partner would say, not everybody's designed to eat like a bunny rabbit. And then again, not everyone's designed to eat like a carnivore. Sometimes we've got the wrong mix of the two. As our ancient ancestors used to say, everything in moderation. Eat a balanced diet. It tends to go better for most people that way, or many people. In general. I don't want to get phone calls from vegetarians or from carnivores saying, I've been eating meat all my life and I'm just A-okay, or I'm purely vegetarian, I don't even look at anything that has a shadow. It's not one of those kind of deals. We just want to try to be concerned about absolutes. Okay. Any other questions? Feel free. I see that philosophical pencil.
I have a friend that had that was severely abused as a child. It was an infant in a child, and now has schizophrenia and other stuff going on, anxiety, depression, CP, she says. And I suppose you would say the abuse probably exacerbated everything, or where that's kind of the epigenetics.
That's a great question, and absolutely, there's more of that in so many different forms. People who have wonderful hearts and adopt children. Okay, I've learned a lot through this process. Adopt children from foreign countries, for example, from Russia, from China. These children quite often have challenges later on in life because they weren't held, they weren't given love or affection. We know from animal studies, terrible animal studies, unfortunately, that if a chimpanzee, as a baby, if you call them that, is given no affection or is separated from the mother, it dies. You can feed it, do whatever, it dies. Absolutely. So anything that happens in childhood is an immense trauma. Now I want to share with you what I call my concept of chemical armor. We used to say or call it constitutions. Okay. We don't know how much any individual can take currently. in terms of insults, or what I would call blows to that chemical armor. But we do know that everyone has a cracking point, whether it's literally birth and a child being autistic, or being 2 years of age and the child regressing with autism, or developing cancer later on in life, or Alzheimer's disease, or maybe it's finally making middle management in that company, but the stress is too much and you start to drink, and you were never a drinker before. Okay, these are what I call blows. Now, as you move through life, there are attacks, insults to that armor, until finally the final blow comes and that armor cracks, and then it just dissipates, and you're left sort of naked to the world. So every insult thereafter has a huge, huge effect, even though for many individuals it might not be quite so strong. And that's one of the things that we believe tends to happen in cases of PTSD. Why do two people go to war, for example? They're in the same battalion. One of them comes back scarred and has either schizophrenia or depression, but his buddy is okay. And they're in the same environment. Okay, we'll say that's different genes. Well, yes, different constitutions, different biochemical pieces of armor. With these children who've undergone these traumatic situations, indeed, you're right, their epigenetic capacities have changed. Dr. Walsh talks about how epigenetic markers can be shifted by trauma. Okay? And that's why it's difficult for these individuals to do better, because we've now got this sort of hard and fastened shift in their genetic capacities to deal with the world. Not immutable, they can be helped, but we have to know how to approach that help. And understanding how to approach these individuals is only going to come about by really first understanding what their genetic or epigenetic capacities are, and then dealing with the particular chemistries necessary to help that person move on. So indeed, it's possible, and it's quite probable, but first we kind of have to really sort of assess that person to see how this all sort of came about, where it's going. We're all living with billions of variables from the start of our existences to now. So every person is an individual that has to be really sort of evaluated on an individual basis. But there's help. There's hope. There's hope.
It would be nice to see people be able to move on and having to do ECT, for instance, these individuals, just this weekly or bi-weekly.
Yeah.
ECT, electroconvulsive therapy.
Brain shock therapy.
Yeah.
And it can be a hard thing for some disorders, for some people it's actually proven to be quite beneficial. For other people it's been just horrendous. We personally try to like to avoid that scenario, but we can't poo-poo it as a medical regimen. We just can't do that.
This was a person with multiple graduate degrees and doctorate, and now has a hard time remembering things from day to day after so many. It's tragic.
It is. Same thing happened to the mother of a friend of mine. Memory gets shot quite often in these scenarios. But it's a matter of where do we feel we've kind of exhausted our options, or where do we feel we are in the treatment paradigm, and that's the next step. And I don't mean we as in Mensah Medical, I mean we as the typical medical community who isn't aware of the other options that are out there that truly do have an impact on these patients. Any other questions? Thank you all for coming, and thank you for your patience